Go ahead and stand up and turn around for me. You're under arrest right now. You got
For
a
what?
warrant. You have a warrant.
For what?
Stand up and turn around, or you can get tased. Put the phone down.
October 15th, 2025. It is a Wednesday in Eagle Point, Oregon, a time of year when the air starts to bite and the leaves turn fast. It is the kind of afternoon that feels routine in a small town, where the police force knows the streets, and the streets know the police. But on Onyx Street, inside an apartment complex, the routine has just been broken. Cyrena Waldron is on the phone with 911, her voice tight with that specific frequency of fear that dispatchers know all too well. She tells them a man has forced his way in. He is 32 years old, his name is Trae Blackbear, and he is refusing to leave. By the time the radio waves carry the dispatch call to the patrol cars, the situation has already shifted. Cyrena updates the operator that Blackbear has finally exited the apartment. He is walking away, moving out into the gray afternoon. But in law enforcement, walking away does not mean the incident is over. It often means the variable has just moved from a contained environment to the open public. Chief Jim Hamilton is the first to respond. He isn't just a patrol officer. He is the chief, which means he brings decades of instinct to the wheel. He scans the streets, looking for a man matching the description, and he spots him near the covered bridge on Main Street. This location is picturesque, a landmark of the town, but today it becomes the backdrop for a confrontation that will be analyzed for years to come. Hamilton pulls up. He steps out of his vehicle, his boots hitting the pavement. He approaches Blackbear, attempting to keep the tone professional, investigative. Hamilton calls out, asking the man to stop. He explains that he is investigating a report of a forced entry on Onyx Street. But immediately, the vibe is wrong. In police work, they call it the pre-attack indicators. Blackbear is agitated. He isn't acting like a confused citizen. He is acting like a man with something to hide. He refuses to stand still, his eyes darting, his body bladed away from the chief. When Hamilton asks for his name, Blackbear lies. He gives a false identity, hoping to ghost through the interaction. He denies everything. He says, "I didn't do anything wrong. I already left. Why are you bothering me?" Hamilton presses him. "We have a report of a forced entry. I need to identify who I am speaking to." Blackbear shakes his head, argumentative, stepping back. "I told you, I wasn't even there." While this verbal chess match is happening on the street, Officer Marc Slagle is working the other end of the investigation. He is backing up his chief, but first, he needs facts. He gets Cyrena Waldron on the phone. He needs to know exactly what crime occurred. Was the door kicked in? Was anyone hurt? Cyrena clarifies the chaos. She tells Officer Slagle that, technically, no forced entry occurred. The door wasn't broken down, but Blackbear had come in and refused to leave. It is criminal trespass, not a burglary. But then she gives Slagle the piece of information that changes the trajectory of the entire afternoon. She confirms the man's real name, Trae Andrew Blackbear. Officer Slagle relays this to dispatch. The radio crackles back with a hit that turns a low-level trespass investigation into a high-risk felony stop. The dispatcher's voice is steady, but the information is heavy. Trae Blackbear has lied about his name because he is a wanted man. He has an active extraditable warrant out of California. It is a parole violation, and the original charge is sexual assault. Suddenly, the calculus on the street changes. Chief Hamilton and Officer Slagle are no longer dealing with a difficult guy who wouldn't leave an apartment. They are dealing with a fugitive sex offender who is desperate enough to use a fake name and is currently agitated. The officers regroup and confront Blackbear again. The air is thicker now. The pretense of a casual chat is gone. Officer Slagle looks at him and says, "We know who you are, Trae. We spoke to Cyrena." Blackbear stiffens. The lie has collapsed. Slagle continues, his voice firm. "You have a warrant out of California. You are under arrest." "Under arrest?" Blackbear snaps back, his voice rising. "For what? I didn't do anything here." "It's a confirmed warrant," Slagle says, moving to close the distance. "Turn around." This is the moment of critical decision. In the mind of a suspect facing extradition and prison time, the fight-or-flight response kicks in like a hammer. Chief Hamilton sees the shift in Blackbear's body language. He sees the tension coiling in the man's shoulders. Hamilton draws his taser, the yellow casing bright against his uniform. He is preparing for resistance, anticipating a scuffle or a run. He is thinking about less lethal options, but Blackbear isn't planning to run. As Slagle moves in, Blackbear suddenly reaches toward a backpack he has with him. It is a movement that every police officer is trained to fear. Hands kill. Reaching into a bag during a confrontation is a universal signal of deadly intent. "Don't do it!" Hamilton yells, raising the taser. But the reaction time gap is a brutal reality of human physiology. It takes a split second to pull a hand from a bag. Blackbear's hand comes out, and it isn't holding a wallet or a phone. It is gripping a knife with a 5-inch blade. In one violent, fluid motion, Blackbear attacks Officer Slagle. The distance is 0. There is no time for de-escalation. The knife flashes and sinks into Officer Slagle's right upper arm. It punctures the skin, slicing muscle. It slashes his forearm. Pain and adrenaline flood Slagle's system. He is under lethal attack. The chief is right there. The transition from taser to lethal force happens in a heartbeat, because a taser cannot match the lethality of a knife at contact distance. Commands are screamed. "Drop the knife! Drop it!" Blackbear ignores them. He re-grabs the knife, ready to strike again. The officers have no choice. The grand jury would later look at this exact second, the active stabbing of a police officer, and find the response fully justified. Shots ring out, echoing off the covered bridge. Trae Blackbear is struck. The threat is neutralized. He collapses to the pavement. The silence that follows a shooting is deafening, but there is no time to process it. Officer Slagle is bleeding. He has a puncture wound and a laceration. His arm is compromised. But what happens next defines the complexity of police work. Chief Hamilton keeps his weapon trained on the suspect, ensuring the threat is truly over. Officer Slagle, despite the blood running down his arm, does not retreat to safety to wait for an ambulance. He runs to his patrol car. He isn't fleeing. He is retrieving his medical kit. He returns to the man who just tried to kill him. With adrenaline still shaking his hands, Officer Slagle kneels down next to Blackbear and begins attempting to render aid. He tries to stop the bleeding. He tries to save the life of the man who just put a 5-inch blade into his arm. Medical personnel arrive within minutes, swarming the scene on Main Street. But the injuries are catastrophic. Trae Blackbear succumbs to his wounds right there, in the shadow of the bridge. Officer Slagle is rushed to the hospital. He requires stitches, treatment for the puncture, and a cleanup of the laceration. He is released later that day, walking out of the hospital alive, but carrying the physical and mental scars of a routine call gone wrong. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. The knife was seized, a bloody piece of evidence measuring 5 inches. The body cam footage, the dispatcher logs, and Cyrena Waldron's testimony were all compiled. The Jackson County District Attorney's Office presented everything to a grand jury. Their conclusion was unanimous and clear. Chief Jim Hamilton and Officer Marc Slagle were fully justified. They reacted to a lethal threat with the only option left to them. This case serves as a harrowing case study in the unpredictability of patrol work. It dissects how quickly a lie about a name can escalate into a life-or-death struggle, and it highlights the warrior mindset required to switch from fighting for your life to trying to save your attacker's life in the span of 60 seconds. To understand why Officer Slagle ended up in surgery and Trae Blackbear ended up in the morgue, we have to step away from the emotional weight of the event and look at the cold, hard physics of a street encounter. When civilians watch body camera footage, they often ask why the police didn't just shoot the knife out of his hand, or why they didn't tackle him before he drew the weapon. But the reality of close-quarters combat is governed by a brutal mathematical equation known as the action-reaction gap. This incident in Eagle Point is a textbook example of how fast a situation decomposes. Let's analyze the positioning. Chief Hamilton and Officer Slagle were standing within talking distance of Blackbear. In law enforcement training, this is often called the kill zone. When Blackbear reached into his backpack, the officers were already at a tactical disadvantage. The human brain takes roughly a quarter of a second to recognize a threat, another quarter of a second to decide on a response, and then even more time to physically move muscles to execute that response. This is the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Blackbear, however, had already made his decision. He was acting. The officers were reacting. This means Blackbear was living in the future, about half a second ahead of the officers. In a knife fight, half a second is the difference between a scare and a severed artery. Consider the choice of weapons. Chief Hamilton initially drew his taser. This speaks to his mindset at that specific moment. He was trying to effect an arrest without using lethal force. He saw a resisting suspect, not necessarily a killer yet. But a taser is an imperfect tool. It requires two probes to hit the target, spread apart far enough to lock up the muscles. It often fails through thick clothing or rapid movement. More importantly, a taser moves at the speed of a projectile, but deploying it takes time. By bringing a less lethal tool to what became a lethal fight, the officers momentarily lost the upper hand. When the knife came out, the dynamic shifted instantly. A knife with a 5-inch blade does not need to be reloaded. It does not jam. It does not require good aim. It simply requires contact. At a distance of less than 10 feet, a knife is statistically as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than a firearm. Officer Slagle's injury illustrates this terrifying reality. Despite two trained officers standing right there, Blackbear was able to draw the weapon and bridge the gap before they could effectively neutralize him. Slagle was stabbed in the upper arm and forearm. This location is critical. The brachial artery runs through the upper arm. If that blade had nicked that artery, Officer Slagle could have bled out in less than 90 seconds. The difference between a stitch-up wound and a funeral was likely a matter of millimeters and luck. The shooting itself was a reaction to this contact. The public often believes that a gunshot stops a threat instantly, like in the movies. This is a myth. A human body pumped full of adrenaline and fighting for freedom can absorb fatal rounds and continue to fight for several seconds, sometimes longer. Blackbear was shot, but he continued to refuse commands and tried to re-engage with the knife. This is why officers are trained to shoot until the threat stops, not just shoot once and wait to see what happens. In those intervening seconds, an officer can be stabbed multiple times. The tactical breakdown here reveals that the officers did everything they could to keep the situation calm, but they were fighting against the limitations of human reaction time. The moment Blackbear's hand went into that bag, the timer started. The moment the knife appeared, the timer ran out. The fact that Slagle was able to transition from being stabbed to creating distance and accessing his own medical gear shows a high level of survival conditioning. He had to override the shock of being penetrated by a blade and focus on the immediate tasks. Neutralize the threat, then treat the wound. This encounter serves as a grim validation of the 21-foot rule, a concept in police training that suggests an attacker with a knife can cover 21 feet and stab an officer before the officer can unholster their gun and fire effectively. Here, the distance was much shorter than 21 feet. It was intimate, it was immediate, and it proves that even when police do everything right, identifying the warrant, covering each other, using verbal commands, the suspect always has the first move. And that first move is often the one that draws blood. If the tactical analysis explains how the shooting happened, the psychological analysis explains why. To understand the events on Main Street, we have to map the invisible landscape of the human mind under extreme stress. The most dangerous weapon Trae Blackbear carried that day wasn't the knife in his backpack. It was the desperation in his head. Psychologically, a warrant is not just a piece of paper. For a man like Blackbear, facing a return to prison for a sexual assault violation, that warrant represents the end of life as he knows it. In law enforcement psychology, this is known as the cornered animal syndrome. When Chief Hamilton asked for his name, Blackbear's brain likely triggered a massive spike in cortisol. He knew that giving his real name was equivalent to handcuffing himself. This fear drives the fight or flight response. But when flight isn't an option, because he is being questioned by two officers in broad daylight, the brain defaults to fight. The lies he told were the psychological armor he tried to wear. And when that armor was stripped away by Officer Slagle's confirmation of the warrant, the psychological dam broke. He wasn't attacking the officers because he hated them. He was attacking the reality of his capture. On the other side of the equation, we have the officers. They started the interaction in what is called Code White or Code Yellow, a state of relaxed awareness. They were investigating a low-level trespass. But the moment the dispatcher mentioned warrant and sexual assault, their psychological state had to shift violently into Code Red. This rapid gear shifting is mentally exhausting and dangerous. When the knife appeared, both the officers and the suspect entered a state known as survival stress reaction. In this state, the body dumps massive amounts of adrenaline into the bloodstream. This causes several physiological phenomena that are often misunderstood by the public. First, there is tunnel vision. As Blackbear lunged, Officer Slagle likely stopped seeing the bridge, the street, or the sky. His peripheral vision would have collapsed, focusing entirely on the threat, the knife. This is why officers sometimes don't see bystanders or other hazards during a lethal force encounter. Their biology is forcing them to focus only on the thing that is trying to kill them. Second, there is auditory exclusion. It is very possible that during the struggle and the gunshots, the officers didn't hear the bangs as loud explosions. The brain filters out unnecessary sound to process visual information faster. Survivors of gunfights often report that their own gunshots sounded like small pops, or they heard nothing at all. Then there is the issue of pain processing. Officer Slagle took a 5-inch blade into his arm. Biologically, he should have been incapacitated by pain. But in the heat of the moment, adrenaline acts as a powerful painkiller. It masks the trauma to allow the body to keep fighting. It is likely that Slagle didn't fully feel the severity of the knife wound until the shooting stopped and the adrenaline began to dump out of his system. That is the moment the crash happens, and the reality of the injury sets in. The psychology of the aftermath is equally heavy. Officer Slagle had to switch from a killing mindset, necessary to stop the threat, to a saving mindset in seconds. This requires a tremendous amount of cognitive discipline. Most people would be paralyzed by shock after stabbing and shooting someone. But police training is designed to override that natural paralysis. Slagle running to his car for medical gear wasn't just a tactical move. It was a psychological victory over the trauma he had just experienced. This incident highlights the fragility of the social contract. In the span of 3 minutes, a conversation turned into a homicide investigation. It proves that in police work, the psychological distance between a handshake and a funeral is terrifyingly short. When the smoke clears and the adrenaline fades, the incident moves from the street to the courtroom. The question shifts from "could they shoot?" to "should they have shot?" In the case of Chief Hamilton and Officer Slagle, the Jackson County Grand Jury returned a verdict of fully justified. To understand this decision, we must look at the shooting through the lens of the law, specifically the Supreme Court standard set in Graham v. Connor. The law does not judge police officers based on 20/20 hindsight. It judges them based on what a reasonable officer would do in that exact moment, with the limited information they had, under tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving circumstances. The grand jury had to weigh 3 main factors. First, the severity of the crime at hand. Trae Blackbear was not just a pedestrian jaywalking, he was a fugitive with an extraditable felony warrant for a sexual offense. This elevated the government's interest in his capture. Second, and most importantly, does the suspect pose an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others? This is where the case for justification becomes undeniable. Blackbear introduced a lethal weapon into the equation. He didn't just brandish the knife, he used it. He successfully stabbed an officer. Once that blade made contact with Officer Slagle's arm, the threshold for deadly force was not just met. It was shattered. Legally, an officer does not have to wait to be stabbed a second time to defend himself. The threat was active, lethal, and immediate. Third, was the suspect actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight? Blackbear gave a false name, ignored verbal commands, and physically fought against the detention. A common question from the public is always, why didn't they shoot the knife out of his hand? Or, why didn't they shoot him in the leg? The law and police training are clear on this. Under high-stress conditions, fine motor skills degrade. Aiming for a small, moving target like a hand or a leg is nearly impossible and highly dangerous. A missed shot at a leg can ricochet and hit a bystander, or it can fail to stop the threat, allowing the attacker to close the distance and kill the officer. Police are trained to shoot at the center of mass, the largest target available, to stop the threat as quickly as possible. The grand jury also considered the sequence of events. Chief Hamilton initially drew a taser. This demonstrated an intent to use lower levels of force. However, the law recognizes that force options are a ladder, not a checklist. You don't have to try pepper spray or a baton against a man with a knife. When Blackbear escalated the force to a lethal level with the blade, the officers were legally authorized to bypass all lower levels of force and meet that lethal threat with lethal force. The investigation revealed that Blackbear refused commands and re-grabbed his knife even after being shot initially. This detail is crucial. It confirms that the threat had not ended with the first shot. The officers ceased fire only when the suspect was no longer capable of attacking. In the eyes of the Jackson County District Attorney's Office and the grand jury, the actions of Officer Slagle and Chief Hamilton were not only within the bounds of the law, but were necessary for their survival. They followed the use of force continuum exactly as it is taught, reacting to the suspect's choices every step of the way. The tragedy of the outcome does not negate the legality of the defense. We talk about tactics and laws, but eventually, violence comes down to metal and flesh. The physical evidence in the Eagle Point shooting tells a story of millimeters. The weapon seized from Trae Blackbear was a knife with a blade approximately 5 inches long. To the average person, 5 inches might sound small compared to a firearm. But in forensic pathology, a 5-inch blade is catastrophic. It is long enough to reach every vital organ in the human torso. It is long enough to sever the brachial, femoral, or carotid arteries. Officer Slagle was lucky. The medical report details a puncture wound to his right upper arm that required stitches and a laceration to his right forearm. These terms, puncture and laceration, describe two different mechanics of injury. The puncture means the blade went deep, thrusting into the tissue. This is the killing blow, the motion designed to hit deep vessels. The laceration on the forearm likely occurred defensively, a slash wound, as Slagle raised his arm to block the attack or as he pulled away. The arm is a vulnerable target. It is packed with nerves and blood vessels. A deeper cut to the forearm could have severed tendons, rendering his hand useless and making it impossible to draw his firearm. A deeper puncture to the upper arm could have hit the bone or the main artery. The fact that Slagle walked away with only stitches is a miracle of geometry. But the most critical piece of equipment that day wasn't the gun or the taser. It was the trauma kit. Modern policing has shifted its focus heavily toward Tactical Combat Casualty Care, TCCC. 20 years ago, an officer might have waited for an ambulance. Today, they carry tourniquets and clotting agents on their belts or in their cars. Officer Slagle's decision to run to his patrol car immediately after the shooting was a textbook example of self-rescue. He recognized he was bleeding. He didn't know the severity yet. Adrenaline lies to you about pain, but he knew he needed supplies. He retrieved the gear and returned to the scene. This moment is paradoxical. The officers used the medical equipment not just for Slagle, but to attempt to save Blackbear. They applied pressure and advanced first aid techniques to the very man who had just tried to end their lives. This is the harsh reality of the job. You are the warrior and the medic in the same minute. Despite the rapid response of medical personnel, who arrived within minutes, the damage to Blackbear was too severe. But the attempt speaks to the training and discipline of the Eagle Point Police Department. They stopped the threat, but they did not stop caring for the human life involved once the weapon was dropped. The seized knife remains in evidence, a rusted piece of metal that changed the course of several lives. And Officer Slagle's scar on his right arm will serve as a permanent reminder of the day the routine became deadly. The yellow police tape has long since been removed from the covered bridge on Main Street. The traffic flows again, and the autumn leaves continue to fall. But for the community of Eagle Point, the events of October 15th have left a mark that cannot be washed away by the rain. This case is a tragedy in the truest sense of the word. A 32-year-old man, Trae Blackbear, lost his life because he felt cornered by his past and chose to fight his way out. A police officer, Marc Slagle, went to work expecting a normal shift and ended up in surgery, carrying the weight of taking a life to save his own. Chief Jim Hamilton had to make the command decisions that no leader ever wants to make. There are no winners in an officer-involved shooting. There is only survival. For the public, this case serves as a stark education. It peels back the curtain on the realities of policing. It shows us that de-escalation is a two-way street. It requires a suspect willing to listen. When a knife is introduced, the time for talk is over. The grand jury's decision to deem the shooting fully justified reaffirms the legal principle that officers have the right to go home to their families at the end of their watch. We also learned about the silent heroes of that day, the dispatchers who relayed the critical warrant information, the medical personnel who arrived within minutes, and the training that kicked in when panic could have taken over. As we close the file on the Eagle Point shooting, we are left with a final, sobering thought. The line between a peaceful afternoon and a deadly encounter is razor thin. It is held together by vigilance, training, and sometimes just sheer luck. Officer Slagle survived his wounds. The bridge stands quiet, but the echoes of that Wednesday afternoon will ring in the minds of those involved forever. This has been an in-depth analysis of the Main Street Bridge shooting. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and watch your six.